the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn. Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky was admired by Nietzsche for his striking insight into human psychology. For Nietzsche, Dostoevsky was immensely valuable as a psychologist, looking deep into the human soul, able to distill and collect information on what makes us human and how we operate. Nietzsche first encountered Dostoevsky late in life, but nevertheless, the scant references to the Russian author that made it into his works are full of praise. His most famous appraisal of Dostoevsky has become a well-known quote in its own right, as he called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. He described his discovery of Dostoevsky's works as a revelation, similar to his discovery of Arthur Schopenhauer decades earlier. The connection between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky has been made before, and even turned into a bit of a cliché. In particular, many comparisons have been made between the type of the extraordinary man, as envisioned in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and Nietzsche's Übermensch. Or what about the famous dictum of Ivan Karamazov, one of the three brothers Karamazov, who argued that if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted? Doesn't that sound eerily similar to Nietzsche's own views on morality and, in particular, the phrase God is dead? In this video, we want to dig a little deeper, beyond the superficial comparisons between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche that have often been made. We'll take a look at biographical information as well, because, as we've mentioned, Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky late in life, and it's unclear which novels of his he had actually read. Interestingly enough, for example, Nietzsche never read the brothers Karamazov, and it's a matter of debate if he had read Crime and Punishment. So already we're forced to look beyond these two works in our analysis. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning with Nietzsche's discovery, which happened by pure accident of Dostoevsky's works, and the big impact it had on him. Speaking of making new discoveries, let's take a minute to talk about Brilliant, the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant.org is the best way to learn math, science, and computer science. They have thousands of interactive lessons, and they add more each month. Even if you're pretty deep into philosophy, it's always fun to brush up on your knowledge and learn new things. For example, they have a dedicated course on logic, which is, of course, the backbone of philosophy. It's a great way to freshen up analytical thinking skills in an interactive, fun way. Personally, I'm not that great at mathematics, so I found it very valuable to go through their numerous modules on math, including introductions to algebra and probability. Even for someone like me, who hasn't used mathematics intensively in years, the intuitive visual lessons that Brilliant offers are a great way to engage that part of my brain again. You can get started for free by visiting brilliant.org/Veldgeist or by clicking the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now, back to Nietzsche. As we mentioned earlier, Nietzsche's discovery of Dostoevsky was purely accidental. It happened late in his intellectual career, in the year 1887, when most of his books had already been written. One day, he was browsing a bookshop in Nice, France. There he saw a little book, translated in French, called L'Esprit Souterrain, by an author named Dostoevsky, a name which was unfamiliar to Nietzsche at this time. But still, he felt strangely drawn towards the work, bought it, and read it. He was immediately enthusiastic. He compared his discovery of Dostoevsky to his chance encounter with Schopenhauer as a youth, an encounter that also took place in a bookshop where Nietzsche felt strangely drawn towards Schopenhauer's work. He read L'Esprit Souterrain and wrote to a friend that not since Stendhal's masterpiece Rouge et Noir has he felt such joy reading a book. Now, if you're familiar with Dostoevsky's works, and you speak a little bit of French, you might reasonably assume that L'Esprit Souterrain is the French translation of Notes from the Underground. But you'd be mistaken. You see, for some reason, this particular French translation completely butchered Dostoevsky's work. The volume known as L'Esprit Souterrain is actually composed of two books by Dostoevsky. First, a book called The Landlady, and secondly, Notes from the Underground. In between, there is a small foreword by the translator that seemingly connects the two stories. To be clear, these stories shouldn't be connected. They are different novels. But for some reason, the translator assumed that the French public wouldn't understand or appreciate Notes from the Underground if it was presented in the way it was originally written. For example, the main protagonist remains nameless. This was a deliberate artistic choice by Dostoevsky, who sought to describe a certain type of person and wanted the reader to identify with the protagonist. The translator, however, arranged the book in such a way that the protagonist from The Landlady, a man named Ordinov, is also claimed to be the protagonist of Notes from the Underground. These two separate stories are thus presented as one, which is a clear violation of Dostoevsky's authorial intent. Even worse, the translator injected some paragraphs here and there of his own writing in order to make a coherent whole out of the two stories. So some parts of the book aren't even written by Dostoevsky himself. So one thing we have to keep in mind is that Nietzsche's first encounter with Dostoevsky was a botched volume lumping together two novels in a dubious translation. However, we also need to be careful not to go overboard with our condemnation. The translation may not be perfect, and the translator may have taken some extreme liberties with the work, but he still retained the core message of Dostoevsky's novel. And it was this core message that spoke to Nietzsche, and immediately made him feel at home in the literary world of Dostoevsky's novels. As we've mentioned, Nietzsche admired Dostoevsky as a psychologist, and in Notes from the Underground we have a prime example of this. The novella is many things, but the aspect of particular interest to Nietzsche was the introspective, psychological profile of the underground man, the book's nameless protagonist. The underground man spends considerable time analyzing himself, his feelings, and his mind, and his conscience. Yet all of this psychological digging leads to nowhere. He can't help being who he is. He can't change his personality or his actions. In fact, he's not even sure if he truly knows anything about himself. Later on in the novel, in a moment of clarity, he admits that lots of what he's written down previously was simply a lie. Even when descending to great psychological depths, he still can't help but to present a picture of himself that is idealized and untrue. His self-knowledge is useless. In fact, it's worse than useless because it becomes a source of pain to know why you are the way you are, yet being powerless to change it. On the surface, being so self-conscious is a good thing, because after all, why would it be bad to know yourself? But the underground man argues the opposite. Increased self-knowledge only leads to despair, because you know how you might be different, yet you remain powerless to actually affect this change. As he writes, "I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. For man's everyday needs, it would have been quite enough to have the ordinary human consciousness, that is, half or a quarter of the amount which falls to the lot of a cultivated man of our unhappy 19th century. But this is not the whole story. The underground man shares Nietzsche's skepticism regarding self-knowledge. The underground man admits to lying to his readers. But it's not a malicious lie, it's a lie born from self-deceit and rationalization. Even though the underground man tries to dig deep within himself, still he can't let go of certain moral prejudices of how one ought to be, rather than looking critically at who he is. Try as he might, he wants to present an honest self-evaluation of his psychology, but a strong moral prejudice within him finds its way through and in the end expresses itself. The underground man is incapable of being honest, but he also realizes this. And this psychological torment is another source of pain. He suffers from what we may call cognitive dissonance. I swear to you, gentlemen, there is not one thing, not one word of what I have written that I really believe. That is, I believe it, perhaps, but at the same time I feel and suspect that I am lying like a cobbler. This skepticism regarding even the possibility of self-knowledge was touched upon by Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. There must be a sort of repugnance in me to believe anything definite about myself. Is there perhaps some enigma therein? Probably, but fortunately nothing from my own teeth. Perhaps it betrays the species to which I belong. Just like Dostoevsky's underground man, Nietzsche believes that true self-knowledge is perhaps not even possible. Unconscious forces are at work, moral prejudices, that obscure ourselves from ourselves. When we try to take an honest look at our own psyche, we run into internal resistance, and this resistance takes the form of rationalization and self-deceit. All psychology hitherto has run aground on moral prejudices and timidities. It has not dared to launch out into the depths. A true psychology, a psychology beyond good and evil, unmoored from adherence to morality, would present to us something very alien, something dark even. But if we are committed to the idea of searching for truth, we must contend with this darkness. We sail away right over morality. We crush out, we destroy perhaps the remains of our own morality by daring to take our voyage thither. Dostoevsky's underground man is trying. He looks deep into his own self, he is committed to confronting the darkness, but he falls just shy of the Nietzschean ideal of the truly deep-going psychology which would see him embrace his darkness as part of who he is, and how that darkness is necessary to him. The underground man strives towards an ideal. He falls short of it, and then he realizes the extent to which he falls short of it. This paradox, and the self-awareness of this paradox, which really touches upon the heart of the matter, is probably why Nietzsche considered Dostoevsky to be such a masterful psychologist. Dostoevsky, to borrow Nietzsche's phrase, launched into the depths, and dared to go further than others had gone, and he revealed through the fictional protagonist of Notes from the Underground something profound about what it means to be human. A great example of one such mechanism of the human psyche that is expertly explored by Dostoevsky is the concept of ressentiment. Dostoevsky dedicates a section of Notes from the Underground to revenge. The underground man takes us through his thought process on the psychological mechanisms behind taking vengeance for an offense. He distinguishes two types of men: those who take revenge immediately without thinking. They are hit and they hit back. But there is also another type of man, a man of so-called heightened consciousness, who does not retaliate immediately. This type of man, the underground man calls him a mouse, sits on his feeling for a while. The mouse is beset with doubts, fears, analyses, while the normal man simply retaliates immediately and secures his vengeance in an instant. The mouse overanalyzes the situation and maybe doesn't even come to revenge. The normal, stupid man, in the underground man's words, finds justice in hitting back. The mouse, overcome with doubt and overthinking, does not see the justice in fighting back. Instead, the mouse sits on his revenge and doesn't act upon it. But this has nasty psychological side effects. Of course, the only thing left for the mouse is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw and, with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even itself believe, creep ignominiously into its mousehole. There, in its nasty, stinking underground home, our insulted, crushed and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in cold, malignant and above all, everlasting spite. What Dostoevsky does in this amazing passage is put into words a psychological phenomenon that will play an increasingly important role in Nietzsche's philosophy. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that this phenomenon becomes important from the Genealogy of Morality onwards, written in the same year as when he read Notes from the Underground. Dostoevsky describes, almost to a T, the concept of ressentiment, and the French word, used by Nietzsche untranslated to German, is used 4 times in this translation of Notes from the Underground. It's very possible that Nietzsche had simply borrowed the word from this Dostoevsky translation. Compare, for example, the psychology of the mouse man with the morality of the slave in the Genealogy. Dostoevsky first explores the mouse wallowing in self-pity, how this fatal brew turns into something increasingly toxic as time passes, as revenge that cannot be exacted outwards turns inwards and becomes self-torture. For 40 years together, it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most ignominious details, and every time will add, of itself, details still more ignominious, spitefully teasing and tormenting itself with its own imagination. Now compare this to Nietzsche, describing the same phenomenon. Ale sufferers burrow through the intestines of their past and present in their search for obscure mysteries, wherein they will be at liberty to wallow in a torturing suspicion and get drunk on the venom of their own malice. They tear open the oldest wounds, they make themselves bleed from scars which have long been healed. An important part of Nietzsche's analysis is that the slave finds a peculiar enjoyment in his debasement. Wallowing in self-pity feels good. But this observation had been made by Dostoevsky as well. But it is just in that cold, abominable half-despair, half-belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underground for 40 years, in that acutely recognized and yet partly doubtful hopelessness of one's position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires turned inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions determined forever and repented of again a minute later, that the savor of that strange enjoyment of which I have spoken lies. The concept of ressentiment becomes fully fleshed out in Nietzsche's Genealogy, and will play an important role in subsequent works such as Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. It's unprovable, but highly likely that many of Nietzsche's ideas about ressentiment, and even the term itself, are borrowed from Dostoevsky's portrayal of the underground man. But to speculate that Nietzsche plagiarized Dostoevsky is also a bridge too far, because we find inklings of the concept of ressentiment in Nietzsche's earlier writings. In Beyond Good and Evil, for example, he writes about the need for religion by those who are intellectually less endowed. They use religion to level the playing field, so to speak. They seek to justify their inferiority by appealing to a sort of equality before God. They are glad in their inmost heart that there is a standard according to which those who are over-endowed with intellectual goods and privileges are equal to them. They contend for the equality of all before God, and almost need the belief in God for this purpose. Without using the term, this is precisely what resentment is all about. But it's hard to deny that Dostoevsky's exploration of ressentiment in Notes from the Underground had no influence on Nietzsche at all. Rather, the most likely conclusion to make here is that Nietzsche read Notes from the Underground and was impressed with the psychological death Dostoevsky represents, along with conclusions about the human psyche that had lingered in his own head as an embryonic idea, and that through Dostoevsky's influence, Nietzsche fully fleshed out these ideas in his subsequent works. So is it any wonder that Nietzsche would honor Dostoevsky with such high praise? From his perspective, they both arrived at similar psychological conclusions. They both dared to go deep within the human spirit, and they emerged from these depths with strikingly similar conclusions. We have not yet exhausted the connections between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. We'll dive deeper on this topic in future videos. If you don't want to miss them, please consider subscribing to the channel. In subsequent parts, we'll revisit Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols and dedicate our time to a passage in which Dostoevsky is explicitly discussed. And we'll also release other videos as well, dealing more in depth with specific works of Dostoevsky and how they relate to Nietzsche's philosophy. In this video, we discussed Dostoevsky's brilliant psychological insight, which could count on Nietzsche's admiration. Whenever Nietzsche is full of praise for someone, it bears pointing out because he generally isn't very generous with compliments. Just like with Ralph Waldo Emerson, it appears Nietzsche found in Dostoevsky a brother soul. Both men had the ambition to look deep within the human soul, embrace the darkness they found there, and climbed out of it with new insights into what makes us human. Of course, both men might have made similar observations as to how humans work. When it comes to the question of how to deal with this new knowledge, their conclusions couldn't be any more different. We'll explore these differences in subsequent videos. Subscribe if you want to tag along. For now, we hope you found our exploration of Notes from the Underground and the genesis of the ressentiment idea valuable. If so, we appreciate a like and a comment on this video, as it lets us know that you want to see more of this content. Or follow us on Twitter if you feel so inclined. As always, a big thank you goes out to our Patreons who make these longer videos possible. Without their support, we couldn't sustain the creation of this long-form content. If you want to join their ranks, support the channel and see some exclusive footage, feel free to take a look at our Patreon page. As of right now, we have over 10 exclusive videos for Patreons only. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.